You only push a mop through the corridors, Orson said to me without looking up from his desk. My name is Cyrus, and I am 44 years old. For 14 years, I kept shift logs in this hospital clean and exact. Every stain on the tile told a true story. Every room left behind a record of who stood there. Orson sat across the room with his coffee cup. He believed the steel filing cabinet by the window held more than just paperwork. He thought it held absolute power over our family. The Finch lineage had an unspoken rule about who controlled the ledger. Myra watched from the doorway with her hands tucked inside her pockets. She was 41 and accustomed to standing quietly while decisions were made. I did not argue with the man. Shift logs demand patience above all else. A clean floor does not reveal its secrets until the very end of the shift. I closed my notebook slowly. The quiet room waited for what came next. I always woke up before dawn. The long hallways of the surgical ward were completely quiet then. A hospital room always tells you exactly who was really inside it, no matter what anyone later claimed happened. And I pulled my cleaning cart slowly down the hall. My daily work taught me to read those tiny marks. People leave stories in the thick dust. You will always learn to look past what people say because the actual physical evidence never matches their polished speeches. Orson never noticed any of those small details. He walked through the corridors like he owned the entire building. Myra carried her clipboard from desk to desk without looking up once. I stayed completely invisible while the heavy shift log quietly recorded everything that actually happened around us every single day. The world outside the hospital operated on a very different rhythm entirely. Orson believed power belonged only to those who spoke the loudest in every room. My own family shared that exact belief without a single hesitation. Rules were never written down in notebooks. They lived in the quiet air of our kitchen. He spoke with total confidence every single morning. Nobody ever interrupted him during these lectures. Orson liked to repeat his favorite family aphorism over his morning coffee while sitting at the head of the dining table. Myra stood near the doorway. She held a ceramic coffee mug. She looked down at the floorboards between her feet. She never raised her voice in protest. Orson pointed the end of his metal pen at the center of the wooden surface to emphasize his point. I spent my days in the surgical ward. Every room kept its own records. A clean floor showed who had walked across it. A shift log recorded the exact time of every event. What was gathered through extra hours and night labor belonged by strict decree to the man who signed the weekly vouchers. Those who held the mops worked silently. They accepted their role without complaint. Their sweat was treated as a cheap commodity. Nobody questioned the fairness of the arrangement. They were told that their daily sweat and tired labor were simply part of the standard uniform required by the household. Myra walked past my chair slowly. She placed some envelopes on the desk. She paused near the edge of the rug. That is just how things work around here, Myra said quietly. She wanted peace more than she wanted any kind of basic fairness in the financial arrangements between us all. Orson smiled at the open envelopes. He reached for his coffee cup. He believed his position was entirely secure. Nobody had ever challenged his authority before. I kept my hands flat against the scarred wooden surface while waiting for the endless noise to finally settle down. The kitchen felt unusually warm that morning. Sunlight cut across the floral curtains. The heavy iron kettle sat on the stove. A low hiss escaped from the spout. Orson adjusted his thick wool collar with a slow and deliberate movement of his heavy hands while staring across the room. Myra avoided looking at my face. She traced the rim of her ceramic mug. Her fingers trembled against the painted clay. She kept her breath shallow and controlled. She knew the unwritten family rules as well as any of us but lacked the stomach to debate them during breakfast. The ledger remained closed on the counter. Its green cover collected dust motes. I ran a thumb along the bound edge. A proper record never required shouting to prove its own accuracy. What was written down in black ink remained true long after the loud voices faded away into the cold morning air. Orson tapped his fountain pen against porcelain. The sharp sound echoed off the walls. He expected everyone to nod along in agreement. His confidence rested on an unspoken assumption. He believed that holding the power to sign checks made him the absolute ruler of our shared family history. The morning hours dragged on slowly. Traffic hummed outside the window panes. A delivery truck shifted gears down on the street. The house settled into a familiar rhythm. I watched the dusty sunbeams drift through the broad shaft of light hovering just above the center of the oak table. Silence filled the remaining space between us. No one else dared to speak out. The heavy atmosphere weighed down every single movement. I closed my notebook with a quiet snap. The fragile foundation of their entire family world rested entirely upon shifting sand, rather than anything permanent or real. Soon enough the afternoon would arrive. the daily routine would resume without interruption. I pushed my chair back an inch. The wooden legs scraped softly. I stood up to finish my morning shift with a very steady and completely unhurried step across the worn floor. Orson stood near the glass window. His heavy wool coat smelled of damp wool and old rain. He looked at the steel filing cabinet by the wall. That gray box held every paper that mattered to our house. Myra walked into the room behind him. She carried her black clipboard under one arm. She set a small cardboard box on the corner of my table. A worn paper sat inside it. It was our mother's recipe card with faded blue ink along the top margin. Orson tapped his metal fountain pen against his thigh. He watched the dust motes drift in the narrow shaft of morning light. "We have to look after the accounts now, Cyrus, so do not worry about keeping your own receipts," she said. I looked down at the wooden surface of my desk. The green ledger stayed shut beneath my hand. Orson nodded once with a slow movement of his chin. He believed every page in this room belonged to him alone. 48 years of life had taught him that loud voices won every argument. I did not say a word in reply to his claim. Myra turned away and walked toward the inner door. Her boots made a soft scraping sound against the painted floorboards. "You are working too late on those shift logs again," Orson said while looking over my shoulder at the open book. I kept my pencil resting flat against the paper grid. My work at the hospital left little room for argument here. Every shift log required precise numbers and clean lines. Orson reached out and touched the edge of the closed metal drawer. He thought power was something you could lock behind a heavy steel latch. I knew better than to argue with a man who held a pen. The room stayed quiet for a long moment while he waited for my nod. I gave him nothing more than a steady look across the desk. Myra came back into the room holding a stack of yellow slips. She laid them beside the cardboard box with the recipe card. "These papers need your signature before noon," she said without looking up from the edge of the table. I looked at the stack of forms. Orson smiled at the corner of the room. He liked the weight of authority sitting in his coat pocket. 48 years of age had made him certain of his place in the family line. I picked up my blue pencil and turned another blank page in my book. The hospital records needed my attention before my afternoon shift began. I stood up slowly from the wooden chair. Orson stepped aside to let me pass through the narrow doorway. The hallway outside smelled of bleach and cold tile. I pushed my cleaning cart past the second ward. Every floor tile in the corridor showed the exact path of boots from the night before. Orson followed me down the passage with his heavy stride. He liked to talk about family order while other people scrubbed the baseboards. Myra stayed a few paces behind us with her clipboard pressed against her chest. She never questioned the rules that Orson brought into the house. She simply carried the papers and kept her eyes fixed on the floor ahead. Orson stopped by the supply closet door. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at my cart. "You spend too much time worrying about small details, Cyrus," he said with a sharp laugh. I wiped a metal shelf with a clean cotton cloth. The hospital rooms required absolute precision from every cleaner on duty. A missed spot on a bedside tray told a story long after the patient left. Orson understood nothing about how dirt settles into corners. He believed control came from signing names at the head of a table. I closed the supply closet door and locked it with a short turn of my wrist. The brass key felt cold against my palm. Myra stood by the water fountain and watched our exchange without speaking a word. Orson turned his back and walked toward the main exit. His leather boots clicked loudly against the polished corridor floor. I watched him go with my hands resting inside my uniform pockets. 44 years of cleaning hospital corridors taught me patience above all else. Every room reveals the truth once the occupants leave it empty. Orson thought his signature gave him permanent ownership of everything we shared. He forgot that records are kept by the people who do the actual work. Orson stood by the heavy wooden desk in the cellar. He held the collection book in his hand. The paper was crisp. Orson looked up with a sharp smile. "This account is finished for you," he said, dropping the book flat against the scarred wood. Myra stood quietly behind him. She held her black clipboard tightly against her dark wool coat. Orson adjusted his cuffs with deliberate slowness. He believed that power belonged to whoever spoke loudest in the room. "I worked on these entries for 14 years, I said. 14 years of keeping every shift log straight. "That labor belongs to the house now," Orson said, pointing a heavy finger at the signature line. "The family rules are very clear on this matter." Myra looked down at her polished black shoes. She did not say anything to defend the work I had done over the years. She only turned a page on her clipboard. Orson leaned forward across the desk surface. His breath smelled of stale coffee and bitter winter air. "You just keep the floors clean, Cyrus," he said. "Leave the real entries to the ones who carry the administrative weight." I kept my hands flat against my knees. The cellar air felt cold against the back of my neck. I looked at the dark wood of the floorboards under my boots. A floor never lies about who walked across it. Orson picked up his pen. He tapped the nib against the paper twice. I watched the motion with quiet attention. "We need this ledger balanced by tonight," Myra said, finally breaking her silence with a thin voice. Her fingers gripped the edge of her black clipboard until her knuckles turned white. Orson nodded at her words. He reached out and drew a bold line across my margin notes. "You are done with the administration side of things," Orson said, looking me straight in the eyes. I did not move a single muscle in my face while he spoke. The lamp on the table cast a yellow light over the drying ink. Orson signed his mark with a heavy hand and pushed the volume toward me. "Take this back to the cleaning supply room," he said, as if I were a stranger hired off the street. I reached out slowly. My fingers brushed the leather binding. The cover felt worn from years of daily use. I picked it up without a single word. Myra turned toward the door and waited for Orson to follow. They walked out together into the evening chill without looking back at my desk. I stood alone in the small cellar workspace. The silence rushed back in to fill the empty room. Orson left behind a half-empty cup of lukewarm water. I picked up the ceramic mug by its handle. The porcelain felt cold against my skin. I carried it over to the small sink by the wall. I turned the handle. Water ran clear over the rim. I washed the glass and set it on the shelf. My shift logs were locked away in the metal cabinet. The brass key rested safely inside my pocket. I did not make a single sound. 14 years of careful tracking, reduced to a pile of scrap paper by a single stroke of a pen. Orson thought a signature made a person real. He thought ink on a page could rewrite the hours of labor spent in the dark. I dried my hands on a cloth. The work in the surgical ward awaited my arrival. Every hallway in the hospital needed my mop before dawn. The building understood my labor, even if the family did not. I pulled my jacket tight around my shoulders and stepped out into the corridor. The ward smelled of bleach. I pushed my cart forward. Orson remained upstairs in the administrative wing all morning, while I preferred the absolute quiet of the lower utility levels. Myra stayed at her desk near the entrance. The morning light drifted across the glass panels. I cleaned the white baseboards with great care. My boots made a steady rhythm against the tiles. The shift log recorded every single hour. Nothing disturbed the very quiet air around me. Monitors beeped softly in the distance. The routine offered a strange kind of peace. 14 years passed quickly. I left the green book behind. Myra walked past me near the old linen closet with her black clipboard clutched tightly against her dark wool coat. She looked at me closely. Orson had taken the ledger keys. My hands felt lighter without them. The old hospital routine continued as usual. Nurses rushed past with medication charts. I kept my head down and worked. Nobody asked about my thoughts. The cool cellar remained damp. Shadows stretched across concrete. The gray steel filing cabinet stood quietly beside the structural pillar while I reached into my pocket for the brass key. I turned the lock slowly. The metal mechanism gave a soft click. I opened the heavy bottom drawer. Dust motes danced in the dim air. This spot became my secure haven. I stored small items inside safely. I opened the drawer. Rags rested inside. A heavy filing cabinet is a loyal keeper of small items because it asks no questions and spreads no rumors. I pushed the tray back. Plastic brushes filled the corner. Waterproof tape sat nearby. Orson signed vouchers upstairs. He believed paper gave him power. I preferred tangible supplies. The metal drawer stayed locked tight. Myra stopped by. She looked around. Orson wants the evening sanitation reports placed directly on his desk by 5 o'clock this afternoon, she said with a flat professional tone. I nodded slowly. Water dripped from the pipe. My mop sat in the bucket. She waited for a reply. I wiped the basin rim. The damp air felt heavy. Nobody else came down here. She turned away. The door clicked shut. Orson believed true dominance belonged to whoever shouted the loudest in a room while I kept my focus on the floor. I stood alone. The cellar was silent. I touched the brass key. Orson had his illusions. I had my cleaning cart. Nobody bothered me down here. The routine provided steady comfort. The cart waited. I checked my list. The numbers added up with absolute clarity on the page because no administrator could argue with a physical supply count. I gathered my tools. Floor stripper filled the jug. Microfiber pads lay flat. Nitrile gloves waited in boxes. I pushed the cart out. The corridor stretched ahead. Night shift had begun. The hospital stayed awake. Footsteps echoed softly. Every tile surface told an honest story about who had passed through during the day without needing any official signature. I moved on. Rooms required attention. Trash cans needed emptying. Sinks required scrubbing. The work was honest. Bellingham kept turning outside. I stayed in my lane. Night nurses took over shifts. Let me put a question to you. Has someone ever mistaken your calm for weakness and helped themselves to what was yours because they were sure you would never say a word? If it was yours too, leave a comment. And subscribe and stay right here, because what was kept inside that filing cabinet is about to matter. The seasons turned slowly outside the narrow basement windows. Winter frosts gave way to damp spring rains across the Bellingham streets. I worked my shifts without complaint. The hospital corridors remained predictable. Orson spent those years consolidating his influence over the administrative wing. He held court near the main reception desk with loud pronouncements about budget allocations and staffing cuts. Myra followed him closely through the sterile hallways. She carried her black clipboard with absolute devotion to his directives. Nobody questioned the authority that poured from his office. They accepted the hierarchy, just as they accepted the fluorescent hum overhead. Down in the cellar workspace, my own routine took on a quieter shape. The heavy gray filing cabinet became my constant companion. Each evening after the mops were rinsed and stored, I unlocked the lower drawer with my brass key. I laid out my ledger and entered the numbers. Every discrepancy found its proper place on the page. The missing hours from the maintenance schedules were noted with exact precision. Supply orders that bore forged signatures were transcribed line by line. I never raised my voice in the corridors. I never challenged Orson when he tossed fresh invoices onto my work table with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You have to finish these entries before tomorrow morning," he said to me without slowing his stride. I nodded and pulled the papers closer. The metal drawer held years of careful observation. A medical facility generates countless paper trails every single day. Supply requisitions cross the manager's desk by the dozen. Overtime claims require authorization stamps and supervisor initials. Orson signed every document with a flourish of his gold pen. He assumed nobody looked past the surface numbers. He believed the staff accepted whatever explanation he offered during weekly meetings. His confidence grew larger with every passing month. He ordered new office furniture for the administrative suite while the floor staff struggled with worn equipment. I documented the expenditure against the actual inventory lists. The two records never aligned. One set of figures showed standard operational costs. The hidden set told a different story entirely about where the funds traveled. As I flipped forward in the record book, I touched the point of my writing instrument to the sheet. The ink dried quickly in the cool basement air. The record grew thicker week by week. It waited patiently in the dark corner behind the boiler. Seasons rotated past the narrow wire mesh windows with dull regularity. Winter frost thawed into spring puddles across the paved courtyard. I kept my head down during every morning shift in surgery. Orson expanded his territory by claiming total oversight of regional expenditures. He held meetings in the main conference room with a booming voice. Myra stood beside him holding her black clipboard with strict loyalty. Nobody questioned the way the administrative budget swallowed up ordinary wages. Down in the damp cellar, my private discipline became second nature. Each evening after the corridors emptied, I unlocked the heavy steel drawer to write down every discrepancy found in the accounts. The register filled page by page with precise factual entries. Supply orders crossed the desk by the dozen every single week. Orson signed them with a heavy gold pen he kept in his pocket. He believed his authority stretched further than any written rule. I recorded the serial numbers of broken equipment that vanished without explanation. I tallied the inflated costs of cleaning solvents purchased from approved vendors. The numbers never balanced when compared against actual hospital usage logs. Myra walked past my work table, carrying fresh schedules for the ward nurses. She never slowed down or glanced toward the dark corner by the boiler. They assumed the basement cleaner lacked the capacity to understand bureaucratic bookkeeping. I spent 40 minutes every night checking sums against the official ledger. That patient persistence turned my quiet cellar into an archive of silent evidence. No single month passed without a new entry joining the growing stack. Summer heat turned the basement walls slick with condensation. I dried my hands with a towel prior to opening the ledger. Orson dropped another batch of invoices onto my wooden table with a thud. "Get these entered into the terminal before Friday afternoon," he said without stopping. I nodded and pulled the papers toward the edge of the desk. He walked away toward the elevators with his shoulders squared back. The stack of completed notebooks grew thicker inside the dark metal container. Every receipt pointed directly toward the systematic diversion of hospital funds. Orson bought new furniture for his office, while the laundry staff used frayed sheets. I documented the exact dates and the exact amounts involved in each transaction. Nothing was left to chance or faulty memory in my underground records. The weight of the accumulated proof pressed steadily against the locked steel barrier. Years of accumulation left very little room for doubt. The bottom shelf of the cabinet held 4 separate hardcover books. Each book was filled front and back with columns of numbers. Orson continued his routine upstairs without feeling any underground pressure. He treated the facility budget as his personal checking account. Myra managed the daily staff schedules while ignoring the financial gaps. I cleaned the surgical ward tiles until they reflected the harsh overhead lights. Then I returned to the cellar to match every forged signature against canceled checks. The paper trail grew longer with each passing quarter. I kept my work completely hidden behind a stack of old maintenance manuals. Nobody visited my workspace except to drop off more paperwork for processing. I accepted the routine because time was the only tool required. Winter returned once more with freezing rain against the basement panes. I locked the steel drawer and slid the brass key into my pocket. The archive was nearly complete after all these long years of silent work. Every figure stood ready for whatever day came next in the quiet halls. The family ledger showed a growing discrepancy in the columns. $48,500 was missing from the maintenance reserves. Orson sat alone in the dim corner of the staff lounge. The overhead fluorescent light hummed with a low vibration. He rubbed his temples with trembling fingers. His collar stayed unbuttoned at the throat. He looked less like an absolute ruler and more like a man who had worked too many consecutive shifts without sleep. A small paper cup of lukewarm water sat near his elbow. He reached for it and took a slow sip. His usual loud authority was entirely absent from the room. Myra stood by the doorway with her black clipboard resting against her thigh. She did not look at him while he massaged his forehead. She checked the margins of her invoice sheet with a blue pen. Orson stared down at the scuffed linoleum between his boots. His shoulder blades curved under his wool coat. He dropped his gaze to a grease spot near the floor drain. "Nobody told us the ledgers would be audited this early," he said to the empty room. His voice sounded thin and tired. He swallowed hard and set the paper cup back down on the counter. The plastic made a dry tapping sound against the laminate. "I have always tried to keep the accounts balanced for everyone," he muttered. He adjusted his glasses with a slow hand. The gesture was clumsy and entirely devoid of arrogance. For a brief second, the administrative swagger dropped away completely. He looked like someone who had lost track of his own math long ago. "I remember when our parents first set up these ledgers," he said. He looked toward the window where the evening rain streaked the glass. "Those early years were hard on all of us." He traced the rim of the paper cup with one fingernail. "I only wanted to make sure the family line stayed secure. My mother used to tell us that someone had to watch the ledger books closely. We needed to handle the financial records together, so nobody else had to worry about the receipts." The phrase echoed differently now that the numbers showed the gaps. Those words sounded less like protection and more like a trap. I stood behind the service cart near the supply closet door. I did not say anything to comfort him. I simply watched the way his hands shook around the plastic cup. $48,500 does not disappear by accident. The audit logs mapped every single missing transfer from the hospital accounts. Orson let out a long sigh that rattled in his chest. He stood up slowly from the chair. His knees cracked in the quiet room. He picked up his coat from the plastic seat and draped it over one arm. He walked toward the exit without looking back at Myra or the counter. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind him with a dull thud. Myra stayed behind for a moment longer. She tapped her black clipboard against her knee twice. She looked at the empty cup left on the counter. She did not mention the missing funds or the audit notices. She turned and walked down the corridor toward the administrative offices. I walked over to the counter and picked up the discarded paper cup. I tossed it into the gray metal wastebasket by the door. The floor beneath my boots was clean and dry. Every line of wax on the tile reflected the harsh overhead lights without distortion. Down in my cellar workspace, the heavy filing cabinet waited in the dark. The bottom drawer held the hardcover ledgers locked with a brass key. $48,500 was documented across 3 separate audit pages. The figures lined up in neat columns that brooked no argument. Truth does not shout in a hallway. Truth sits quietly inside the records until someone opens the cover to read what is written there. The basement air felt unusually cold that morning. Orson sat at the heavy wooden table. He held a stiff piece of paper in his fingers. It was a notarized statement drafted by his own legal counsel. He laid it flat on the wood. "This document settles every single dispute about the funds," he said. I looked down at the signature. He had signed his name with a proud flourish. He believed the paper granted him total immunity from any inquiry. Myra stood near the damp concrete wall. She held her black clipboard against her dark wool coat. Her eyes drifted over the messy stacks of invoices. She did not reach out to touch the pages. "You should read the terms very carefully," she said. Her voice sounded thin in the drafty room. I did not touch the statement right away. I walked slowly over to the heavy gray filing cabinet by the window. My hand found the small brass key in my pocket. The key turned without a single squeak. I pulled open the bottom drawer. The metal glided smoothly on its tracks. I reached inside and pulled out the second hardcover ledger. The pages contained 14 years of daily hospital shift logs. Every single entry recorded exact hours and supplies. Nothing had ever been erased or altered. Orson leaned back in his wooden chair. He crossed his arms over his heavy chest. "You cannot argue with a formal declaration," he said. He tapped a finger against the notarized statement. I opened the ledger to a specific page. The date matched his own written claim down to the exact day. The numbers told a very different story from his speeches. $48,500 appeared under suspicious supply orders. His signature sat beside the fake entries. He had written the amounts down himself. He provided the proof in black and white. Myra stepped closer to the wooden table. She looked down at the open ledger. Then she looked at the notarized paper resting beside it. The dates lined up perfectly with the hospital records. Orson frowned at her sudden silence. He stood up abruptly from his seat. He pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders. "This is a private family matter," he muttered. He tried to grab the statement back. I kept my hand flat on the paper. The shift log did not care about his family rules. It recorded every movement through the building. Orson stared at the ink on the page. He realized his terrible mistake far too late. He had put his crimes in writing. The notarized statement proved malicious intent. It matched the missing funds down to the final coin. I closed the ledger with a quiet thud. The damp room stayed completely silent around us. "We must look after the accounts now, Cyrus," he had told me long ago. "Do not worry about keeping your own receipts," Orson said back then. I remembered those exact words vividly. Now those personal receipts were completely unnecessary. His own written overreach had done the work for me. The paper trail led straight back to his desk. He backed away slowly toward the door. Myra watched him leave without offering a single word of defense. A hospital cleaner learns to read a room very quickly. You see who tracked muddy boots across the floor. You see who tried to scrub the stains away. Orson never cleaned a single floor in his entire life. He thought signatures held more power than honest labor. The notarized statement sat squarely in the middle of the table. It was the best piece of evidence I could ever ask for. I locked the filing cabinet with a steady hand. The brass key felt cold against my palm. My mother recipe card stayed safe in the back of the drawer. Orson was gone down the hallway. His heavy footsteps faded against the concrete floor. Myra remained by the doorway for a long moment. She finally turned and walked out into the corridor. I sat alone in the quiet cellar. The church hall smelled of old beeswax and damp wool. Orson sat near the front under the carved wooden crucifix. He clutched his leather folio tightly against his chest. The heavy silence filled the empty room completely while we waited for the afternoon shadows to lengthen across the floorboards. I placed my cardboard box on the oak table. The cardboard was worn at the edges from years in the damp cellar. Orson cleared his throat and avoided looking directly at my face. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "A floor never lies about who walked across it," I said. Orson blinked and tightened his grip on the leather straps of his folio. Myra stepped forward from the side doorway. She carried a thin manila folder instead of her usual black clipboard. She set the folder down beside my box without making a sound. "I should have turned those papers in months ago," Myra said. Her voice sounded thin and tired in the large space. She did not look at Orson while she spoke. Orson shook his head and tried to steady his hands. "This meeting is entirely unauthorized by the committee," he said. He reached into his coat pocket for his gold fountain pen. The pen felt heavy and useless in his trembling fingers. I opened the cardboard box and slid out 14 years of hospital shift logs. Every single shift had been recorded in precise black ink. Every missing supply and forged signature occupied a specific line on the page. Orson stared down at the open pages with wide, bloodshot eyes. He recognized the handwriting from the administrative wing. "You kept every single record down there," Orson said. His voice dropped to a low whisper that barely carried across the room. I nodded and kept my hands flat against the wood. The hospital basement kept the moisture away from the fragile paper. Myra pulled a single yellow slip from her manila folder. She slid it across the oak table toward Orson. "You signed this voucher for equipment that never arrived at the ward," Myra said. She finally raised her chin and met his desperate gaze. Her small gesture offered no rescue for me, but it broke her silence for good. Orson let out a long breath through his nose. He dropped his gold fountain pen onto the wooden table. The metal barrel rolled a few inches before hitting the edge of my box. No one else spoke in the quiet hall. The afternoon light shifted across the rows of empty wooden pews behind us. We sat together in the fading light and waited for the district inspector to arrive with the final audit papers. The heavy oak door of the hall finally creaked open. An inspector stepped inside with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He walked slowly down the center aisle toward the front table. His boots made a steady hollow sound against the worn pine boards. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small cardboard rectangle. It was our mother's recipe card with faded blue ink written across the lined paper. She kept it safely in the kitchen drawer while Orson signed the weekly vouchers upstairs. I laid the card gently beside the heavy stack of shift logs on the table. Orson stared at the familiar blue handwriting without moving a single muscle in his face. That recipe belonged to our mother, Myra said quietly from her chair. You took more than financial accounts from this family over the years, Orson, she added. The district inspector placed his audit papers flat on the wood between us. He opened his metal pen and waited for our official statements. I kept my hands resting flat against the scarred wooden surface. The records spoke clearly enough without any shouting from the empty pews. The slate steel record storage box rested silently within the humid basement studio. Orson's entire career hung by a thin thread inside my locked drawer. $48,500 of forged signatures rested quietly under a brass key. I could have marched upstairs to the main office right now, with every single page of ironclad proof against him. Every invoice and shipping slip pointed directly to his deliberate deception over the years. The temptation to destroy him was real, but I let the moment pass without a word. Myra waited upstairs in the bright administrative corridor. She knew precisely what the thick green ledgers contained. Revenge felt heavy like wet concrete poured across a finished hallway floor. I refused to spend my remaining years chasing after a broken man who only understood how to take from everyone around him. The temptation to ruin his reputation flickered briefly before fading into the damp cellar shadows. Letting go felt colder than anger, yet infinitely cleaner than seeking petty vengeance. The paperwork stayed safely inside the metal drawer. I locked the brass mechanism with a sharp click. He fully expected me to drag his name through the mud until nothing was left of his proud administrative title. Such an act would consume my days with anger and bitterness. I preferred to leave his failures buried beneath old maintenance manuals, where nobody else would ever bother looking for them during their shifts. I chose absolute silence instead of public destruction. Destroying him completely would never bring back my mother or fix the quiet damage done to our family over time. Leaving the accounts alone took far more restraint than opening a new investigation. My cleaning cart awaited my attention in the hallway outside the boiler room. The hospital walls absorbed every secret without ever offering a single judgment in return to anyone. The surgical ward stayed quiet during the early hours. The hospital floors required thorough daily cleaning every single morning regardless of who currently signed the fraudulent supply vouchers upstairs. Orson could keep his small title and his empty authority. His debts belonged to him alone, and I had no interest in carrying that heavy burden across the shiny tile floors of this facility. Holding leverage does not mean you are required to pull the trigger on someone who is already destroying himself from the inner core outward. Some battles leave everyone covered in soot and ruin. I wiped my hands clean and pushed my cart toward the north wing. The building needed proper maintenance far more than it needed another bitter scandal involving senior hospital management. True power is knowing you hold the winning hand and simply refusing to play the game on their terms. Orson would continue walking the halls with his false confidence. Myra would keep shuffling her papers between desks. I would remain down here with my mop and my quiet routines. Let the ledger gather dust in the dark bottom drawer where it belongs forever. The hospital morning began at 6. I pushed my cleaning cart down the long tile corridor. Myra walked past me carrying a standard black clipboard. She wore no jewelry on her hands anymore. She handed me a brown envelope containing the single piece of paper before continuing down the quiet main hospital hallway. Inside rested the recipe card, written in my mother's hand. Myra had left it on the break room table for me to find. She stopped walking and turned around to face me. "I am finished with the old books," she said quietly. I nodded and kept my hands flat against the steel railing while she walked away. Orson stayed away from the administrative office entirely. His empty desk remained cleared of all gold pens and leather folders. The morning supervisor checked the daily attendance logs without raising her voice once. Nobody mentioned the sum of $48,500 during the routine shift handover meeting held down in the damp basement office. I simply nodded and wiped the laminate counter with a damp cloth. The records spoke for themselves in the bottom drawer, waiting quietly for whatever came next. I walked down to the cellar workspace before noon. The heavy gray filing cabinet sat quietly in the damp corner. Using my brass key, I slid open the lowest drawer. The old hardcover ledgers rested neatly beside the empty metal box. My mother's yellowed recipe card finally found a safe permanent home right on top of the heavy stacked green ledgers. Myra stepped into the doorway wearing her simple wool coat. "I do not want any trouble anymore," she said softly. I told her the work spoke for itself. She turned and walked away toward the wooden stairs. The hospital floors required constant sweeping and careful attention throughout the long day. Every room told a true story through the scuffs and footprints left behind. Orson packed his personal belongings into a small cardboard box and left the main administrative building without a single word. Myra stayed behind to finish her paperwork without demanding extra authority over anyone. Orson walked out the glass front doors into the midday rain without looking back. I picked up my push broom and started sweeping room 4. The work continued because floors always needed cleaning. I locked the cellar door and pocketed the brass key securely in my pocket. The large Bellingham Hospital carried on peacefully with its steady daily rhythm under entirely new and quiet hospital administrative supervision. Nobody signed registers with gold ink or pretended to own the family lineage anymore. The shift log remained open on my wooden desk waiting for tonight. Every entry recorded the simple truth of what happened during the long hours. With a gentle movement, I put the volume away and meticulously scrubbed my hands. The floor stayed clean and honest beneath my boots. You understand now why the basement stayed quiet. Revenge is a loud word that demands a large audience. I never wanted an audience down in the damp cellar. The gray metal cabinet remains locked in the dark corner. Orson still sits at his desk upstairs every single day. He signs his name with that heavy gold pen. He thinks he won because nobody stripped away his title. You might feel the urge to demand a public accounting for every single wrong you carry. That hunger burns until you feed it with useless noise. I chose to let the fire go out entirely. Myra walked down the concrete steps just before noon arrived. She set a warm porcelain mug down on my desk. The steam rose slowly toward the low concrete ceiling. She stood there for a quiet moment without speaking. I looked up from the stainless steel wash basin. "We can finish the rest of this work tomorrow," I told her. She turned off the single overhead light and walked away.